The waitress had barely placed the breakfast in front of Caleb when he noticed the woman standing outside the diner window, staring at his plate as if she hadn't eaten in days. She was soaked from the morning rain, wearing a thin gray coat that was far too large for her, and trembling so badly that Caleb could see it even through the glass. He looked at the plate, then at his 8-year-old son sitting across from him, and made a decision that would change all three of their lives forever. Caleb had only ordered one breakfast because that was all he could afford: 2 eggs, toast, sausage, and a small cup of coffee. His son, Noah, had already eaten half of his toast, carefully saving the other half for later because Caleb had taught him never to waste food. Caleb himself hadn't eaten since the previous afternoon, but when he saw the woman outside, he pushed his plate toward the edge of the table, stood up, and walked toward the door. What he didn't know was that this simple act of kindness would eventually bring powerful attorneys searching for him across the United States, carrying documents connected to a fortune worth more than $1 billion. Before we continue, if you believe kindness still matters, if you believe one small act can change someone's life, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. You never know when a small kindness from you might become the reason someone keeps going. It was a cold Tuesday morning in Cleveland, Ohio, and Caleb Morgan was already exhausted before the sun had fully risen. He was 36 years old, a single father, and worked maintenance at a small apartment complex on the south side of the city. His life had never been glamorous, but he had once believed he was building something stable. Then his wife, Hannah, had died unexpectedly after a long illness, leaving Caleb alone with their young son. The medical bills had swallowed their savings, the apartment rent had increased, and every month seemed to bring another problem. Still, Caleb refused to let Noah see how frightened he was. Every morning, he smiled, packed his son's lunch, checked his school bag, and told him everything would be okay. Sometimes Caleb wasn't sure whether he was comforting Noah or himself. That morning, Caleb had only $11 in his wallet. He needed gas for his aging pickup truck and had promised Noah they would buy a new pair of shoes after his old ones began splitting at the soles. Breakfast at the diner wasn't really part of the budget. Caleb had stopped there because Noah had a school field trip later that week, and Caleb wanted to give his son one good morning before another difficult week began. The diner was warm, bright, and almost empty. Noah sat across from his father, swinging his legs beneath the booth and telling him about a science project. Caleb smiled and listened, pretending he wasn't thinking about the unpaid electric bill sitting on his kitchen counter. Then he saw the woman. She stood near the window outside, staring at the food inside. Her hair was wet, her cheeks were pale, and her hands were wrapped tightly around her arms. She looked like someone who had been sleeping somewhere she shouldn't have been sleeping. Caleb watched her for a few seconds. Then Noah noticed her too. He quietly asked his father why the woman looked so sad. Caleb didn't know what to say. He looked down at his breakfast and realized he was sitting there worrying about money while another human being was standing outside worrying about whether she would eat at all. Without making a big announcement, Caleb wrapped his breakfast in a napkin and walked outside. The woman immediately stepped backward, embarrassed. She seemed frightened that someone might accuse her of begging. Caleb simply handed her the food. She stared at the package, then at him, unable to understand why a stranger would give her something so valuable. Caleb told her that everyone deserved breakfast. The woman began crying. She tried to refuse, but Caleb insisted. He explained that he had a son waiting inside and that they were going to be okay. He didn't tell her that he wasn't sure they would be. She finally accepted the food with shaking hands. Caleb returned to the booth, and Noah watched through the window as the woman sat beneath an awning and ate every bite slowly, as though she wanted to make the meal last forever. Caleb ordered nothing else. He drank his coffee and smiled when Noah offered him half of his toast. That tiny moment stayed with him. He had no idea that someone else had been watching too. Across the street, a black SUV had stopped at the intersection. Inside it sat a private investigator named Marcus Reed, who had been searching for a missing woman for nearly 3 weeks. He had checked hospitals, shelters, police stations, bus terminals, and homeless outreach centers across several cities. The woman he was searching for was not an ordinary homeless woman. Her name was Grace Whitmore. She was the widow of billionaire businessman Jonathan Whitmore, whose technology company had recently been valued at nearly $2 billion. But But Grace had disappeared after a family dispute. Her husband's death 6 months earlier had triggered a vicious legal battle over control of the company. Grace had refused to sign documents transferring certain assets to her husband's business partners. Then, after receiving threats, she vanished. Her attorneys believed someone was trying to force her into surrendering control of the Whitmore family trust. Marcus had been hired by the Whitmore family's legal team to find her before something happened. And that morning, through the windshield of his SUV, he saw Grace sitting outside a diner with a breakfast she clearly hadn't been able to afford. He didn't approach her immediately. Instead, he watched the man who had given her the food. That man was Caleb. Marcus wrote down the license plate of Caleb's pickup truck. He didn't yet understand why the stranger mattered. 2 days later, Grace disappeared again. Marcus and the attorneys eventually located security footage from the diner. They discovered that Caleb had been the last person known to have spoken to Grace before she vanished. But Caleb had no idea. He returned to work, repaired broken pipes, changed light fixtures, and worried about Noah's shoes. He thought the diner was simply another ordinary morning that had passed. Then, 3 weeks later, everything changed. Caleb was working in the apartment complex parking lot when 3 black SUVs pulled through the gate. He assumed they were there for a property inspection. Then 4 professionally dressed attorneys stepped out. The first man carried a leather folder. He looked directly at Caleb and asked if he was Caleb Morgan. Caleb immediately became nervous. He wondered whether he'd somehow missed a court payment or gotten into trouble with the apartment complex. But the attorney introduced himself as Jonathan Whitmore's estate lawyer. Caleb had never heard the name. The attorney told him they needed to ask him about a woman he had met at a diner. Caleb's heart sank. He remembered Grace immediately. He told them what had happened. He explained that he had given her his breakfast because she looked hungry. The attorneys exchanged a look. Then one of them opened the leather folder. Inside was a handwritten note. The paper was old and slightly wrinkled. The attorney explained that Grace had been found safe several days earlier in another state. She had finally agreed to tell her attorneys everything that happened after she disappeared, and she had repeatedly mentioned Caleb. She had told them about the man who gave her food without asking her name, without demanding anything, and without knowing who she was. But that wasn't the only reason the attorneys were there. Grace had also told them something that stunned everyone. On the morning Caleb gave her breakfast, she had been carrying a small envelope containing the only original copy of a legal document proving that her late husband's business partners had attempted to illegally seize control of the family trust. She had hidden the envelope inside her coat. When she realized someone was following her, she panicked. She had left the envelope beneath a loose floorboard in a public shelter before fleeing. But before she left the diner, she had trusted Caleb enough to tell him one thing. If anything happened to her, she wanted someone to know that she had been there. She remembered the license plate of Caleb's truck. That was how the lawyers found him. But there was another surprise. Grace had not only survived, she had regained control of the Whitmore family trust. And according to the lawyers, she wanted to meet Caleb personally. Caleb couldn't understand why. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't a lawyer. He hadn't done anything extraordinary. He had simply given away breakfast. When Caleb arrived at a private office in downtown Cleveland, he expected to meet a billionaire's widow surrounded by security guards. Instead, Grace walked into the room wearing a simple blue sweater. She looked healthier, but Caleb could still see the sadness in her eyes. She thanked him. Caleb told her she didn't owe him anything. Grace disagreed. She explained that when she was at her lowest point, everyone around her wanted something. Her money, her signature, her influence, her inheritance. Caleb had been the only person who had wanted nothing. He had looked at her and seen a hungry human being. That mattered more to her than he could imagine. Then Grace made Caleb an offer. She wanted to create a foundation using part of the Whitmore fortune to help struggling single parents, homeless families, and children facing food insecurity. And she wanted Caleb to help run it. Caleb almost laughed because he thought she was joking. He had no experience running a foundation. But Grace told him that was precisely why she wanted him. He knew what it felt like to count dollars before buying groceries. He knew what it felt like to hide fear from a child. He knew what hunger looked like. Months later, Caleb's life looked completely different. The foundation opened its first family resource center in Cleveland. It provided groceries, temporary housing assistance, school supplies, job training, and emergency support to struggling families. Noah's shoes were replaced, but Caleb never forgot that first breakfast. One afternoon, He stood inside the foundation's food center and watched a young father walk in carrying a little girl. The man looked exhausted and embarrassed. Caleb recognized that look immediately. Instead of asking questions, he walked over and handed the man a warm meal. The father stared at him with tears in his eyes. Caleb simply smiled, because he knew. Sometimes people don't need a lecture. Sometimes they don't need someone to remind them how badly their life has gone. Sometimes they just need someone to say, without words, "You matter." And Grace never forgot the breakfast either. Years later, when reporters asked her what changed the direction of her life, she didn't mention the billion-dollar company, the attorneys, the court victory, or the family fortune. She talked about a hungry morning in Cleveland. She talked about a single father who had less than $11 in his wallet and still gave away his breakfast. And she said that was the moment she remembered that the world wasn't completely broken. Caleb never became obsessed with the money he eventually helped manage. He still drove an ordinary vehicle. He still visited the same diner. And every Tuesday morning, he ordered 2 breakfasts, one for himself and one to give away, because Caleb had learned something that money could never teach him. You don't have to be rich to change someone's life. You don't have to have power to give someone hope. Sometimes, the greatest fortune a person can possess is the willingness to give when they have almost nothing left. If this story touched your heart, please don't just watch and scroll away. Like this video, share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness still exists, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us that one good choice can change an entire life. And before we end, I want you to leave a special comment. Kindness is never wasted. Write those words below if you believe that even the smallest act of kindness can come back in ways we could never imagine. Because somewhere tonight, there may be a person standing outside a diner window, wondering if anyone sees them. And maybe the person who changes their life won't be a billionaire. Maybe it will simply be someone with an extra sandwich, a few minutes to spare, and a heart willing to say, "You deserve this." Caleb gave away 1 breakfast. Weeks later, billion-dollar lawyers found him. But the real reward was never the money. It was knowing that, on the morning when he had almost nothing to give, he gave someone hope. And sometimes, hope is worth more than $1 billion.